Hello and welcome to the Better Without Billboards podcast. I'm Nicola.
And I'm James.
And we are very excited to welcome you to Series 2 of Better Without Billboards.
Series 2, baby!
Yay!
Here we go. We've got big plans for Series 2. We're going to kill off some main characters. We're going to a parallel universe later on. Just
Can't
some
wait.
classic Season 2 shenanigans.
Excellent.
But for today's episode, episode 1, Series 2, we're taking a look at meat advertising, meat and dairy advertising in particular, which is a topic we've wanted to cover for a long time, mainly because we're a bunch of woke vegans over here at Ad Free Cities, but also because we've just come out of Christmas season where we're surrounded by adverts for turkeys, for burgers, for sausages, for just about anything that you can think of. So it feels like it creates this idea that Christmas isn't Christmas without the meat. Is that fair to say, Nicola?
Totally. So before, like in the run up to Christmas, we walked around Bristol and you cannot avoid meat adverts. Every other advert is for meat. We saw billboards showing giant hams, giant turkeys, festive burgers, even chicken nuggets made to look like stockings. It was really unavoidable, just meat advertising everywhere in the run up to Christmas.
And now it's almost the other side of it. So we're in January, which for many has become established as Veganuary, where people try a plant-based diet at least a few days a week throughout the month. So it feels like a good time to be reflecting on this issue, on the role and influence and impact of meat and dairy advertising and the meat and dairy industry.
Yeah, it really does feel important to be looking at this. I mean, we all know that we need to reduce consumption of meat and dairy, but this industry has such huge power and influence in terms of lobbying and in terms of just the sheer amount of advertising they're putting out there. So it really it makes sense that if we want to reduce demand for meat and dairy, we have to tackle the power and influence of the industry on our policymakers, our culture, our behaviour and our choices, and that includes through advertising.
Fantastic. So we've got an interview to share on this today. Nicola, do you want to tell us a bit more about who you spoke to?
I do, yeah. So last week I spoke to Caitlin Smith of the Changing Markets Foundation. I really enjoyed my conversation with Caitlin. She's been looking at the influence of the meat and dairy industry, and our conversation explored how the industry uses the same tactics of the tobacco and big oil industries to distract us from the harms they're causing and to delay the action that we urgently need. So Caitlin Smith is a senior campaigner with the Changing Markets Foundation. They're an organisation that exposes irresponsible corporate practices and drives change towards a more sustainable economy. Caitlin works on the Changing Markets methane campaign, advocating for companies and governments to urgently reduce their methane emissions. And she's led research into the narratives underpinning big meat and dairy's tactics to distract, delay and derail climate action. And we go into that a lot in our conversation. She's a passionate advocate for climate justice, and Caitlin previously worked across climate, conflict and gender equality campaigns with child campaigning groups at Save the Children.
Brilliant. Let's hear a bit of that interview now.
So hello, Caitlin. Welcome to the Better Without Billboards podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing really good, enjoying the crisp wintry air today. So yeah, very well. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's really great to have you on the podcast. Can you tell us, first of all, who is the Changing Markets Foundation?
Yes, so the Changing Market Foundation was set up around 10 years ago now, and we're a campaigning organisation who work to shift market share away from unsustainable products and companies towards more environmentally and socially beneficial solutions. So we work on global issues, but sometimes we have a national or regional focus as well to that work. And we do that by working through partners and working with other research organisations and foundations to lead public campaigns, support campaigns, and we run investigations to expose irresponsible corporate practices.
And you've been looking at the lobbying and marketing tactics of the big meat and dairy industries. Can you first briefly summarise what the problem is for us? Why do we need to worry about the power of this industry and the impact that they have?
Yes, I can. So we have three different campaigns that we run at the moment. One is on fashion and microplastics, and one is greenwashing, and one is methane emissions. And the meat and dairy campaign really transcends the methane piece and greenwashing. So there's two kind of major reasons I would say we should be kind of concerned about this industry. One is their impact on legislation and climate lobbying. So they are very powerful lobby groups. And the other is this potent greenhouse gas, methane. So methane is a lot less well known than CO2, but is already responsible for around 30% of global heating today. And it is 80 times more warming over a 20-year time period than CO2. So it's very, very powerful. It's what you might call a super pollutant. And the largest source of methane comes from animal agriculture, so ruminant livestock, really, so cows and sheep. Basically, when they burp, they produce methane. But because methane is really short-lived, so it's only around in the atmosphere for around 12 years compared to CO2, which is around for a much longer time, it means we have a really significant opportunity to keep global heating within the 1.5 degrees of the Paris Agreement. So if we can urgently bring those emissions down, we will see quicker results in its impact on global heating. On the other side of that, you have the big meat and dairy industry. So big meat and dairy companies have been lobbying to derail climate legislation all across the world. And these companies have really significant emissions. So they're comparable to whole countries. They're not insignificant. So Nestle, for example, has the same emissions as New Zealand. And JBS, which is a big meat producer in Brazil, has the same emissions as the UAE, which is obviously a massive fossil fuel state. So these are really massive numbers that have a huge impact on the environment and on climate change. So it really matters what they're doing, and it really matters that they're kind of held accountable for their methane emissions in particular.
So you talked there about the lobbying power, and that's the work that took you to COP29 in Azerbaijan, wasn't it? So can you just tell us what is it that you were doing there at COP?
Yes, so we were at COP, just two of us, one each week, so a small contingent in the very large COP space, but we were able to hold several events there, and we, together with partners, were involved in the Action on Food Hub, which was a kind of side event pavilion space to talk about food system transformation. So we were really there to make sure that methane was on the agenda, and specifically agricultural methane. So what we found at COP29 was that, this gas might be on the agenda, but very rarely is it discussed within the agriculture sector. And that's because of something that we call agricultural exceptionalism. So this idea that the agriculture industry should somehow have preferential treatment compared to other polluting industries like the fossil fuels, where you might be holding them more to account. So agriculture is a bit of a kind of hot potato for governments, and they don't often want to address it in the same way that they might for other sources of methane. So methane also comes from energy sector and also comes from the waste sector.
And were you able to take a look at some of the industry discussions that were happening there? What activity were you seeing from the industry at COP?
So we went to a number of different events, and we found evidence of a lot of industry tactics that we are quite common and that we outline in a report that we launched last year called The New Merchants of Doubt. And that report is really a kind of one-stop shop for the industry playbook of tactics to derail climate action. So within that, we have three different sets of tactics. One is distract tactics, delay, and derail. So for distract tactics, these are things like greenwashing, any kind of narratives that might support this. So anything that kind of creates a collective placebo effect. So making things look all green and happy, and things are moving, nothing to worry about, all that kind of thing. Delay tactics are when the industry focuses on voluntary measures that are happening. So basically, this is used to say we don't need any legislation or accountability for the industry because we're already taking action in this very voluntary, often kind of maybe not so transparent way. And then derail tactics are the most aggressive tactics. And this is what you might be able to call kind of the end game for the industry, which is to completely remove climate legislation from the table. And sometimes we've seen this in the EU, for example, during the last Commission, that at least 10 of the Green Deal policies in the last EU Commission were weakened or completely derailed by industry influence. And that was through things like direct threats and intimidation, direct lobbying and direct lobbying, using crises like the war in Ukraine and COVID-19 to avoid any action or climate legislation coming into play. And for anyone that's not aware, the Green Deal really promised a more sustainable food system and lots of climate action within the region. So trying to kind of work on that now. Again, a lot of civil society now have got a new commission in place, but obviously that was a big setback from the industry there. So at COP specifically, a few of those narratives came up, in particular, a lot of the greenwashing pieces. This is things like the green deception is one of the things that we refer to in our kind of narrative storytelling that the industry use. So this is where companies downplay the impact of their emissions and upsell the solutions. So regenerative agriculture is something that came up a lot in different discussions at COP and in various events that we attended last year. And while regenerative agriculture does have some benefits for soil health and biodiversity, it's really ill-defined as a concept. Compared to agroecology, is something which has much more kind of concrete definition. So we found in previous reports, companies like Nestle have used the term regenerative agriculture, I think it's around 141 times between their sustainability report and their net zero plan. So this is kind of, being used quite a lot by the industry. And mostly industry are using it to not to talk about soil health, but to talk about carbon sequestration in the soil. So, it's again, upselling the solutions, but without looking at reducing livestock numbers. Just for a bit of an example of why that's important, there was a study that came out last year, I think by NYU, which kind of did some mapping of what that would look like in the US context. So if all of the cattle in the US became grazing cattle instead of in industrial systems like many of them are, it would actually increase methane emissions by 43%. So on its own, this is not a solution to global heating. It has to come with a reduction in animal numbers, which is not something that we're seeing come from most companies' commitment, though they do like to use the term quite frequently. So that's a taste of some of the things that we saw there.
Do you think it's fair then to say that, a lot of the industry is putting a lot more effort in resources into making us think that they're doing the right thing than they are actually trying to do the right thing?
I think in some cases that is certainly true. So, and we did highlight that in our research as well. So we did a mapping to see just how much money companies were putting towards low carbon solutions. And in particular, we compared this to their marketing and advertising spend. So JBS, who are one of the biggest meat companies in the world, I think their spend on low carbon solutions is 0.03% of their annual revenue. So this is a tiny portion of their income. And that's based on their 2022 revenue. And compared to their marketing and advertising spend, it equates to around 6% of their marketing and advertising budget. So you can see the disparity is pretty significant within many of the companies that we looked at in our report. And those like JBS, along with Marfrig and Minerva, these are some of the really big companies in Brazil. These are really important companies to watch and to be making sure are being kind of held accountable for their emissions. The next COP is going to be held in Brazil, so COP 30, that'll happen in November this year. And those companies have a lot of lobbying influence within Brazil. So it's definitely something that we kind of need to keep an eye on as civil society and continue to call out in terms of that disparity between what might be on the front page and what's actually happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, and I mean, you've touched on there some of the similarities between what you draw on a lot in your report, the similarities that you identify between the tactics of the big meat and dairy industries and those of big oil and tobacco before them. And certainly that's something that we see with big oil, that a lot of effort and resources is put into advertising campaigns telling us how green they are. When you look at the proportion of money that actually is going into that, it's minute. Can we talk a little bit more about distraction? Can you give us maybe one or two examples of those distraction tactics that you've been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And, very similar, like you said, to kind of big oil. before them, I mean, there was lots of pushes, I'm sure lots of listeners of yours will remember, and it's still ongoing actually, around natural gas, for example, is a good one, right? It's pushed by the industry to say, oh, look, there's this great clean natural fuel that we can use instead. And that kind of push and narrative is definitely what we see from big meat and dairy companies too. So one of the big ones I would say that people would recognise from supermarket shelves is carbon neutral labelling. So that's something that we've seen a lot. And this is really a lot of the time based on offsets, where most people would assume that that means that they're not producing emissions. Actually, it's clever accounting of the emissions that they are producing, and then, looking at offsets to try and make it seem like they're having a kind of negative or non, insignificant impact. In reality, these are really misleading claims, and they do have a massive cost often on emissions and environmental implications as well. But in some regions, these claims are now being cracked down on, which is really good news. So in the EU, for example, there's the Green Claims Directive, which should be coming into effect this year. And that will mean that companies won't be able to create or use any of these vague claims anymore. So they will have to give a very, very clear accounting of where that claim's come from, how they've come to that claim, and they won't be allowed to use offsets to make those claims, which I think is going to be hopefully quite impactful within the EU in any case.
I'm also really interested in looking your report at how meat and dairy advertising deliberately targets a Gen Z audience, really because young people are choosing plant-based food for ethical reasons. They're concerned about the impacts of meat and dairy. So this targeting of that audience is really worrying, isn't it? Can you tell us a bit more about that? What do those tactics look like, and how can we spot them?
It's really worrying that that's happening, and it's disheartening, really, to see. That's probably too mild a term to say, but it feels, there's this great activist movement happening with young people, really caring about what happens to the climate and wider environmental implications of that. But we did find in our research that the industry seem concerned about that group, and it is like you said, because a lot of that group of people are choosing to consume differently and to have a different diet. Not necessarily to be vegan, but just to reduce meat and dairy, and when they do buy it, to buy it more ethically and sustainably. So we found that happening in 3 different ways that I'll touch on. So the first is in schools. So in schools, the meat and dairy industry have been working quite hard in some countries to influence children's dietary choices. So in the EU, we found that when the EU school milk scheme was up for revision, the dairy industry lobbied very, very hard to make sure that alternative milks would not be included in that scheme, and they were successful in removing them from that scheme. In the US, we highlighted in some of our previous research investigations from Wired. They did some really good research looking into the American Farm Bureau Federation. And there, they've been really pushing industry-backed lesson plans to boost the reputation of the cattle industry in the US. So this is, not just about what's on offer in terms of, a school milk scheme, but actually what's going into the lesson plans themselves. And they even created children's comics showcasing that if you eat lots of beef, you can be really strong and win the school race, completely ignoring the health implications of overconsumption of red meat, which is listed by the World Health Organization as a probable carcinogen. So this is really quite disturbing tactics, I would say. The second is through advertising, and particularly on social media and social media engagement with young people. So here we found the big meat and dairy industry engaging with PR firms, and these are often PR firms who have also worked with fossil fuel companies in the past. So Edelman is one of the biggest ones, and they've worked previously with Exxon and with Shell. And for this, they worked on the Undeniably Dairy campaign, working with Mr. Beast, who is a very influential YouTuber. And on that, their definition of success was that people who'd been exposed to the campaign had a purchase intent for dairy alternatives reduced by 6%. So they're actually, specifically showcasing in their indicators that they're trying to shift the dietary patterns of young people away from any alternatives. And then the final one I just wanted to mention is kind of more traditional advertising that you would see on billboards, TV adverts, that kind of thing. And this has been particularly prevalent in the UK and is particularly important this month as well, with the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board. So they run a campaign called Let's Eat Balanced, which is aimed at younger people and launched during the time of veganuary to try and counter veganuary. And as well, on their website, they include in their kind of indicators of success that people who were exposed to the campaign were able to better defend their health choices or their dietary choices. So again, it's really an active response to young people looking to shift their diets and trying to stop that from happening. And again, actually with Let's Eat Balanced, this also was had the involvement of another fossil fuel PR firm, Ogilvy, this time, who've worked with fossil fuel companies too.
Thank you for outlining some of those examples. It is really worrying, and there seems to be such a strong focus on the health benefits, on sort of promoting the health benefits of meat and dairy, which, while, as you say, completely ignoring the health implications, the potential damage that a diet that is too heavy in meat can cause. And I think that is really worrying, and that targeting of the young audience just seems incredibly cynical when the industry knows that this is an audience who are genuinely trying to make those changes for, like you say, climate reasons and also for their own health. So, Caitlin, we've talked about those distraction tactics. I wonder, before we start talking about maybe some of the solutions, which I'm sure listeners will want us to come on to, how does those distraction tactics link to these other tactics that you've talked about? So this problem of the industry delaying the real progress that we need, the policy reforms that we need. How are those linked together?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I go into that, or maybe a different type of example of that, actually, you just made me think of a story that was, or, a message, I guess, that came across really strongly in one of our events at COP. We had an agricultural farmer from Sri Lanka on one of our panels there, and he was talking about exactly this challenge with the kind of push that meat and dairy are essential for health, which, they can be part of a healthy diet within certain, quantities. That's, I think, fairly agreed and not something disputed. But the problem is we're massively over consuming, and actually there are perfectly credible, viable, healthy alternatives. And that's the bit that's kind of being, the credibility of that is definitely being attacked by some parts of the meat and dairy industry. And this speaker on our panel was giving that example from Sri Lanka and talking about food sovereignty and the colonization of the food system, and how big dairy companies in particular had lobbied really, really hard to put the message across that, you need to have dairy to get your main source of calcium, and ignoring the fact that there's lots of more traditional and local foods that are also very, very high in calcium, and the big issue that was causing for local diets and the power of the industry in that particular country. So it's a really real world example of how this is impacting people, not just in the UK, but, on a global scale. And I think that's also quite clear in the example of the EU school milk scheme as well, right? So there's the public advertising that goes along to encourage you, if you think about that old campaign, what was it called? Just Milk, right? With everyone had the milk mustaches, and, that's something I really remember when I was growing up. And, that's really sticks with you. And then you have that, then you get your free school milk in the school. That's all part of a policy environment that is enabling this to take place. It is not happening in a silo on its own. And that real targeting of children from a young age is it is quite cynical, and it is really, in some cases, very much intended to try and build a support for the industry from that young age with those children. So in Brazil, that's happened through a targeted campaign called Agro is Cool, and this is really backed by a lot of the big meat companies there. And the aim of the campaign is to build a sense of trust and pride in the Brazilian agricultural system with children. So this is really embedding that kind of agricultural exceptionalism that we talked about earlier, and that romanticized notion of what farming is. And of course, there are lots of brilliant small farmers who work on agricultural farms and really try and farm organically and do all these really positive examples of farming. But big industry is really blurring the lines between that type of farming and the big industrial farming outfits. And, by building that romanticized notion of farming from a young age, it's really kind of enabling them to hide behind the scenes and avoid accountability for the pollution that big kind of industrial industry is causing.
So we can see that the huge power and influence of the industry is a problem. It's holding us back from where we need to be. We've talked about how animal agriculture is, a significant contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that climate scientists pretty much all agree we need to drastically reduce methane, we need to drastically reduce consumption of meat and dairy. So, and you've given us a better understanding of the tactics that are upholding the meat and dairy industry and preventing this progress that we need. Now, there is a lot more in your report, Caitlin, about the influence of the meat and dairy industries and the examples of tactics that they'll use. It's a really thorough report. So we will add a link in the show notes so people can take a look at that. But now let's just talk about what the changes that needs to happen. So what does need to happen? What can we do?
Yes. There is lots that we can do. Everyone will be pleased to hear. It's not all depressing, and there's lots of things that can happen, and there are lots of groups and bits of legislation in different countries that are on the agenda that are looking much more positive towards a kind of more sustainable food system. So I think first of all, certainly for us at Changing Markets, our big priority is on methane, is this emergency brake that we see for global heating, and we really are pushing for governments to have national methane action plans that include specific methane reduction targets for agriculture. And within that this is really including dietary shift as a big part of that plan. So it's not just focused on technical measures, but it's really looking at the whole food system and food system transformation within that. We also would recommend that, meat and dairy companies should be properly regulated. We should be obliging them to make sure that they have science-based targets on emission reduction, that this includes all the scopes of their emissions, and that they have their own methane emission reduction targets as well. And this as well would necessarily, really involve them looking at their supply chains. What is it that they can change? How can they reduce the herd sizes that they need to reduce in order to meet that target? And then the other part of that is really making sure that there's support to farmers to reduce herd sizes and to switch to more sustainable food production, like organic farming, like agroecological practices, and to make sure those farmers who are already doing those practices, that they're also part of the plan, right? And they're not left behind, and that they're also being supported. At the moment, a lot of public funding in lots of countries globally, actually, including previously in the UK, I'm not 100% sure now, since Brexit, but in the EU, certainly the vast majority of public funding goes to industrial and animal farming. And so, really making sure that we switch that up so that, those farmers who are doing the best practices have that financial support. And that public funding has shifted to support healthy and environmentally friendly diets. A lot of people really struggle to have a healthy and environmentally friendly diet, and to afford to do that, it's not always cheap. And that's part of the problem too. We really need to make sure that imbalance is shifted. So, instead of public advertising towards red meat, we have that encouragement of healthy dietary choices in place. And linked to that last part, I think, is really, thinking about that funding for advertising example. Both of those examples we talked about earlier in the US with the school systems and with the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board in the UK, they are similarly funded, not identical, but similar kind of government-backed programs. In the US, it's called a checkoff program, and in the UK, it's called a levy system. So in the US, for example, the beef checkoff program is funded through a $1 contribution per head of cattle for each farmer. So they give that $1, and then that goes back into the advertising work that's then being put into influencing the school curriculums and that comic strip book that we talked about. So effectively, this is kind of government legislated funding that's going to support advertising campaigns for further meat consumption in countries that are already over-consuming, which is having a really negative impact on people's health. So that really needs to change. And especially that agriculture is already being significantly impacted by climate change and global heating. We're seeing that happen in the UK a lot recently with the floods that happened last year. Farmers are really struggling in the face of that climate change. So if we don't take some urgent action, including that sector within that action, it's really going to harm, especially the smaller farmers.
That was super interesting and loads to pick up on, loads to go and think about. But first of all, Nicola, I wanted to, just for my own benefit, make this a little bit more concrete. I mean, could you give me some examples of what this kind of meat and dairy advertising looks like in the real world?
Yeah, I think we can pick up on those AHDB ads that me and Caitlin mentioned.
Right. So just pause straight away there. So who are the AHDB and why have I never heard of them before?
Yeah, good question. So the Agricultural and Horticultural Development Board, the AHDB, they're a public body. They're known as an arm's length government body, and they're funded by levies on farmers. Now, they've been running this marketing campaign annually for the last few years called Let's Eat Balanced. And the stated aims of this campaign are, I quote, to protect long-term consumer attitudes towards naturally produced British red meat and dairy and reinforce how they help form part of a healthy and sustainable diet. So that's their aim. And this year they have a partnership with a YouTube channel called Tasty UK to specifically target 18 to 25-year-olds, this Gen Z audience who we were talking about with Caitlin.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about this Let's Eat Balanced campaign. Could you describe some of the adverts for me, bearing in mind that we're talking about visual adverts on an exclusively audio-based platform? But as best as you can, Nicola, describe the adverts to me and the listeners at home.
I'll do my best, James. I mean, listeners might be familiar with these adverts. Last year, and I think this year again, the theme is a little bit of this and a little bit of that. They're voiced by Richard Ayoade. People might have seen them on social media, in cinemas, I believe, and on television this year. They're doing adverts on television. And the theme is very much about promoting beef, lamb and dairy as part of a balanced diet. I would say that they strongly suggest that these foods are a sort of essential or an important part of a healthy diet. And they very much focus on the nutrients involved. So B12 is quite a common part of the advertising, focusing on the benefits of B12 to your diet and really suggesting that a diet containing beef, lamb and dairy is the only way of getting these nutrients, which as we know is not correct.
Okay, so this is interesting. It's really bringing me back to what Caitlin was talking about earlier, that kind of trifecta of deny, delay and distract that we see in so much meat and dairy industry lobbying. So it sounds like these ads are designed to leave the audience unclear about the benefits of plant-based diets versus meat and dairy diets. Is that fair?
That is right. Look, the issue here is, as we know, is that we need to reduce meat and dairy consumption, and that is for many reasons. For climate, for nature protection, for health, for animals. We know that the UK's own Climate Change Committee recommends a significant reduction in meat and dairy consumption, and we know on health that the NHS warns that eating too much red meat probably increases your risk of bowel cancer, and we know that research shows that 43% of adults, that's over 50% of men, are consuming more than the recommended limit of 70 grams of red or processed meat every day. So this is a problem. And an investigation by Ben Webster from Open Democracy last year found through freedom of information requests that despite privately acknowledging these health risks, the AHDB is publicly failing to mention these risks and recommendations. So very, very much along the lines of these distraction tactics that Caitlin was talking about.
Okay, yeah. So it's one thing kind of behind the scenes, and then what's publicly facing in these adverts is almost the opposite, really.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so what then are the options for clamping down on this or for regulating this?
Well, we at Ad Free Cities, last year, we raised a complaint to the regulator, the Advertising Standards Authority, or ASA, about the Let's Eat Balanced campaign. The basis of our complaint was that the adverts were using imagery of green fields and nature, which was very misleading, when in reality a significant proportion of cows have no access to outdoor space, which most people don't realise. And also we said that the adverts gave a misleading impression of the impact of beef and dairy production on the environment, and that they strongly suggest that meat and dairy are important for good health. It's not just us who are concerned about this, right? So last year, a group of health professionals wrote to the HDB calling for them to drop the campaign. They said the health claims are disingenuous. They said red meat is a risk to humans, both through the health risks highlighted by the NHS and through the meat industry's role in driving climate change, which is really the greatest threat to human health. In addition, the food campaigning NGO Feedback Global, they called on the big retailers to pull out of the campaign because this is a campaign that supermarkets are also involved in. But this year it's back again. Again, promoting the supposed environmental and health benefits of red meat and dairy, targeting a Gen Z audience, leaving out any mention of the health risks or the need for this very widely recognised reduction in the amount of meat we're consuming that is needed.
Wowzers. So if the regulator isn't stepping up, what other options are there to tackle this kind of thing?
Well, we know that advertising is driving up demand for industrially farmed meat and dairy. So we need solutions which address that demand. Firstly, it would be great to see, as we talked to Caitlin about, it would be great to see the government ending its support for marketing campaigns like Let's Eat Balanced, which promote meat and dairy. We don't see government-backed marketing campaigns for plants, for example, which is really what people need to be increasing in their diets, not meat and dairy. So it'd be really great to see that. That would be an excellent first step. And then we spoke previously on this podcast to Councillor Ben Parker from Edinburgh Council about their policy which restricts advertising for harmful products including polluting cars and fossil fuels on council-owned advertising sites. We know from our conversation with Ben that the council seriously considered including meat and dairy in those harmful ad category restrictions. It would be great to see councils take this step to restrict advertising for industrially farmed meat and dairy at a local level. And it would then be great for this to lead on ultimately to an end to advertising for industrially farmed animal products on a national level, which is really what we need in order to really, make the progress that we need to make towards reducing demand for these products. Look, it might seem like a radical proposition, but as we've discussed previously on this podcast, tobacco advertising was ended because we knew how harmful tobacco was for our health. We are increasingly recognising the damage done by intensive farming to our climate, to our health, to nature, and to animals. Ending advertising for this industry is what's needed.
Well, this has been a super interesting episode for me to be part of, because I think going into it, I was very aware of the cultural power of advertising for meat and dairy, like those Christmas ads we talked about at the start. But it's this political role, right? The lobbying influence of not just the adverts, but the industry behind it. The adverts almost hide that lobbying influence, right? It's like a veil of secrecy. And that's the role that those adverts play. And that's really opened my eyes in a big way to what's going on here. So thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Caitlin. Any final remarks on this from you, Nicola?
I think just to say it's important to recognise that advertising really is doing a very good job at what it's meant to do, which is driving up demand. And that's the reason why, I guess if we haven't emphasised that enough, that's the reason why we feel that advertising needs to be tackled, but this driver of demand needs to be removed. And we can all play a role in that. We can all play a role in recognising when advertising is misleading us, in noticing the tactics that are being played out, in raising complaints to the ASA, in calling on our councils to restrict advertising for harmful products. So we can all play a role in this as well.